Okay, so hello and welcome to this webinar on coaching and action learning sets. So my name is Jo Alcock and I'm a freelance trainer, researcher and coach with a background in the library and information sector. I do have an ILM certificate in coaching and I also have received training in action learning sets, and I've been putting the skills for both coaching and action learning into practice over the last few years. I am part of my own action learning set. I find it very beneficial for my own professional development, and I also facilitate action learning sets for other groups as well. And I also provide training on coaching skills. So today is going to be a sort of whistle-stop tour of the main concepts and things behind coaching and action learning sets, but it's a very brief overview of the kind of main things. So I'm not professing to cover everything today. But it is an introduction. It's an introduction to coaching. It's an introduction to action learning sets. And action learning sets, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a form of group coaching, and that's why we can't kind of go straight into the action learning sets until we've covered some of the basics of the coaching. So it's really important to review some basic coaching skills before we can set into the context of action learning sets, which, as I say, is a form of group coaching. So what is coaching? Some of us may be familiar with different types of coaching. We have things like life coaches and career coaches and also executive coaches. And although these all have a slightly different focus, obviously, the core principles behind coaching are the same, and these are the things that I'm going to share with you today. So coaching focuses on developing action to help people move forwards. It's very focused and it's usually fairly short-term in nature, and it's designed to help people set goals, refine those goals, and work out how they can move towards those goals. It requires commitment from the coachee, that's the person receiving the coaching, to put things into practice after the coaching session. So there's a commitment there between the coach and the coachee to commit to the coaching session itself and then to put things into action afterwards, after they've received the coaching. It avoids telling. So one of the key things about coaching is that it avoids telling people, and it focuses instead on facilitating those people to come up with their own solutions. So in this way, coaching differs from something like mentoring, where usually a mentor will have more experience and they will offer advice and suggestions based on that experience or based on other people's experience. This isn't the case in coaching. The coach may be more experienced but doesn't necessarily need to be. And the priority for the coach is to help the coachee find their own solutions and actions rather than think about what they might do in the situation. So it's very much about empowering the person receiving the coaching and for them themselves to come up with those suggestions and ideas that will work best for them. And that's where it's a little bit different from the traditional offering advice and offering mentoring. One common analogy for coaching is that a coach acts as a mirror. And there are a number of different reasons behind why this is used as a common analogy for coaching. Firstly, and probably most obviously, the coach reflects back to the coachee. So this can often be quite literally in terms of reflecting back using the same terms. And this can really help to clarify things for the person receiving the coaching. Often this can result in further discussion, as the coachee might realise that what they'd said to the coach wasn't quite the full picture, or that different terms might be more helpful to be used in that sense. By encouraging the coachee to verbalise and clarify things, it can often lead to a deeper understanding of them, which is the second point about how it's like a mirror. In the same way that when we look into a mirror, we gain a deeper understanding of the true situation of what we're seeing in that mirror. The same is true during a coaching conversation. And we often don't get the opportunity to explore things in so much detail. So this is an opportunity for the coachee to gain a really deep understanding of the situation, also how it's impacting them and how they might be able to move forwards. In the same way that a mirror does, the coach also provides the boundaries for the conversation, and they provide a frame, much like the frame of a mirror, in that they hold the space for the conversation to take place. In this way, the coach doesn't alter the focus or the direction of the conversation in any way, but they hold that space for it to take place. And they do this through effective listening and effective questioning. Require effective coaching is listening. 5 different levels of listening at the same time. So we want to aim to be spending most of our time in the 5th level, which is referred to as active listening. It means we have to look at the other levels of listening. The first level we go to at the me now level, and this is where we're essentially waiting for our turn to speak. So we're listening to the other person, but we're mostly listening so that we can see when there is an appropriate pause so that we can speak. One time that we might use this level is when we're introducing ourselves in a group situation. So we're listening to the other people's introductions, but part of us is preparing what we're going to say in our introduction, and we're waiting for our opportunity to speak. The focus when we're doing this type of listening is very much on us and waiting for the pause so that we can then speak. The second level of listening is the just like me level. And this is where we listen for what people are saying and we look out for things that we can relate to, things that we perhaps have in common with them. So we often use this level of listening when we're meeting new people, when we're making new connections, and often in this kind of circumstance, having a common topic to discuss can be really beneficial. So we listen out for things that the person is saying that we can relate to, and then we perhaps share our own perspective on it. And we can make commonalities here. And this could be something as simple as owning a cat or liking Disney. And so we can then use this as a basic for a conversation and say, oh, that's like me as well. So that's our second level of listening. The third level of listening is where we take this one stage further from level 2, and we focus on the do it like me. So this is where we relate to something that someone is saying in the same way that we do with the level 2, but then we start to think about how we would approach the situation. So we share something about ourselves, and we can think about setting that into the context of the same situation that that person is discussing or a similar situation. So this level is commonly used when we're chatting to a friend or when we're sharing experiences with people. The focus is on helping the other person, but it's coming from our own perspective. So we're sharing what we would do or what we have done in that situation. The fourth level of listening is where we start to encourage more information from the person talking. The focus shifts a little bit at this level to be more about the person speaking than about us as listeners. So we use this level when we want someone to share more information about what they're talking about. And often this is because we're interested in hearing more, we're intrigued by what they have to say. So this could be a verbal cue, so actually asking them for more information, or it could be a non-verbal cue as well, such as nodding to encourage them to say more, or tilting the head to show that you're listening and that you want them to say more about the situation. And the final level, the fifth level, as mentioned, is the active listening level. And this is the level that we ideally want to aim for most of the time whilst we're doing coaching. And this is where we're listening not just to the words, but we're also listening to the meaning. And we're trying to pay attention to the non-verbal communication as well. So we're also encouraging more information, like in the fourth level. But the focus is slightly different here because we do so with the purpose of helping the person talking rather than because we're interested in the information for ourselves. So that's the level that we want to be thinking about, being present within that active listening mode when we are doing our coaching. Now, obviously, when we're doing coaching, we're not just listening, we also want to be contributing to the conversation, and the way that we do that is through effective questioning. So we need to consider the different types of questions that we ask people when we are coaching to help the person move forwards. Now, there's a common mnemonic here to help people remember the different types of effective questions. It's not quite spelt correctly, this does bug me somewhat, but it can be quite useful to remember a rose at this point. So you picture a rose, remember the different types of questions, and each of these letters will go through that describe a certain type of question that you can use during effective coaching. So the first letter, the R, is for reflective, and this is where we reflect back something that's just been said to us as a question. So for example, someone might be talking about something and they might end what they were saying with, so I tried a new approach but it was unsuccessful. And the coach might then simply reflect back and say, unsuccessful, and ask that as a question. Sometimes the coachee at this point will realise that actually it wasn't quite accurate and it wasn't totally unsuccessful, so they might explore in more detail what they meant. Or they might confirm that yes, it was unsuccessful, but they might explain why in this particular instance that was the case and how it might differ in the circumstances. So either way, a reflective question can be a really useful tool to help people reflect more on what it is that they are thinking and feeling about this, and to elicit more information, as well as sometimes help to clarify things. And this is really important when we're setting goals and when we're thinking about where we want to get to as well, to make sure that we're helping the person receiving the coaching to clarify this. So that's reflective questions. The H in rows is for hypothetical. And hypothetical questions are an excellent tool in coaching, as often when we're presenting something that we're receiving coaching on, it's because we feel a little bit stuck. So perhaps we've kind of hit a hurdle and we don't know how to progress. And by asking a hypothetical question, that can kind of release us a little bit and get us to think about what would we do if that hurdle wasn't there. So sometimes it can help us identify other solutions that we might not have thought about because we can't do that because there's a hurdle. And then what we can do is adapt those solutions once we then start to bring the hurdle back into the equation. Or sometimes it can help us realise that actually the hurdle that we think is a big deal isn't such a big hurdle after all. So sometimes making us think about things in a slightly different context can be really useful, and hypothetical questions can be used effectively in this way. It can also sometimes make it easier to consider situations that are a little bit more sensitive if we take ourselves slightly outside of that. So hypothetical questions can enable us to think about things from a different perspective as well. The O in rows is for open questions, and these are really crucial in coaching. So during a coaching conversation, the person receiving the coaching is the person doing most of the talking. The open questions help to ensure that they are encouraged to explore things fully. So who, what, where, when, which, how, all these questions can be used in this way. We must be careful to aim to be as open as we can in the way that we structure the question. So if the coachee could answer the question in just a couple of words, then you might want to think about whether you could rephrase the question to make it a little bit more open. The S isn't really a type of question, but it stands for silence. And silence is another really valuable tool in coaching, as it allows time for the person to think. So initially we might be quite eager to ask lots of questions to try to get people to explore things more fully. But actually sometimes taking time to allow the person to condense what they've just shared can be incredibly important. And silence, when it's used effectively, can also elicit more information. And often we can tell that someone has more to say, but they just need a little bit of thinking time. So it's important as a coach to not be afraid to use silence as a tool to help someone process what it is that they're thinking. And the final type of question is encouraging. And so this is both encouraging in the way that we just spoke about, where we're encouraging more information, can you tell me more? But it's also in the way that we deliver that. So it's about encouraging them in the way that we are delivering it, where we are encouraging and supporting them, as well as encouraging more information. So those are some examples of the different types of questions that can be really effective in coaching. So we have reflective questions, silence, and encouraging questions. So now that we've thought about what types of questions can be used effectively in coaching, we also need to think about some of the types of questions that we might want to try to avoid during coaching. So often these are opposite to some of the previous ones, but specifically just some examples here. So the first is closed questions. So have you tried that before? That can be answered with a yes or a no. What we really want to do is to get people to explore more information and to share and open up on things. So we need to try to think about not asking closed questions, asking questions that will prompt further discussion. Other types of questions to avoid are leading questions, and this again because this coaching is not about telling someone or advising someone or offering guidance. The information comes from the person receiving the coaching. So leading questions are things that we should try to avoid. The way that we might want to get around this is swapping the question around, and I'll discuss this at the end of this slide. But leading questions where we have a suggestion are things that we ought to try to avoid during coaching, because we need to make sure that these suggestions and ideas come from the individual, not from someone else. Nosy questions are also ones that we should try to avoid during coaching. And this is often because we're really curious and we want to know more about a situation. And this can be, at times, this can make it more difficult if we are close to a situation or if we're coaching someone in a similar environment. Sometimes it can be much easier to be coaching someone in a slightly different environment because you don't know as much about that situation. So we don't want to be asking questions to find out more information about it, because we don't need to know much more information. The coachee understands that and they need to explore it more. But the sort of questions where we're asking them specifics about the situation, that's not going to be a benefit to the person receiving the coaching. So we need to try to avoid those. Why questions are tricky ones, because there are sometimes exceptions to this, but generally why questions can sometimes be the sort of nosy type questions. And they can also sometimes result in quite a defensive response. So we need to be quite careful not to use why questions too frequently. Sometimes they can be relevant, but we just need to use caution with those. And the final one, which is a definite no-no, is asking a multiple question. The actual question itself is more there as a prompt rather than a specific question that we want the coachee to answer. So asking multiple questions can confuse the coachee and can lead it in a slightly different direction. So we should only ask one question at a time when we are doing coaching. So all of these types of questions that might come to mind when we're doing coaching can be rephrased in a more constructive way, just by thinking about some of the Rose methods. Some of those previous types of questions, whether we can rephrase what we're thinking about here to make it more open, to make it hypothetical, to make it reflective, etc. Another tip is to think about what question led you to what you were thinking about and to ask that initial question instead. And this might lead the coachee in the same direction that you went, or it might open up, it gives them scope to go elsewhere as well. So for example, the first question that's on here, have you tried that before? Instead of asking a question like that, we could ask the questions like, what do you think might happen if you tried that? That person might then explain what has happened when they've tried it in the past, or they might explore the option in more detail to help them refine it. Either way, it's likely to elicit more information and get them to explore it a lot more than asking a closed question such as, have you tried that before? So that's one way to kind of think about how we can ask effective questions. So that's the listening and the question aspects with a broad overview. But before we move on to action learning sets, we just want to cover how to structure a coaching conversation. There are loads and loads of different approaches that can be used. And if you have received coaching training, then you may well be aware of quite a few of these, and there's lots of information online. One of the simplest ones, and the ones that we will focus on for today and for during our action learning sets, is one of the most common models, and this is the GROW model. This is what we're going to go through a little bit now. So GROW is yet again another mnemonic, and we can use this to help us remember 4 different stages which can be used to structure a coaching conversation. As mentioned, there are lots of other different ways to structure it. This is just one of the ways that we can structure a conversation. So the first thing that we start when we're using the GROW model is with the goal. And we start by trying to establish the goal to understand what it is that the coachee wants to achieve. So at this point, we might ask questions to help them clarify and help them refine the goal a little bit as well. So it might start out as quite a broad goal, or it might not be very clear in their mind. And so we ask them questions at this point in the conversation to clarify the goal and refine it a little bit more. Once you've clarified that goal, we then explore the reality, so that's the current situation. So at this point, we'll ask questions to enable the coachee to expand a little bit more on the current situation, to think about this from their own perspective, obviously, but also potentially to think about it from other people's perspectives as well, and try to consider what might happen if things stayed as they were. So once we've established our goal and our reality, we then want to think about how do we get them to move from the reality to the goal. So this is where we consider the different options which could help the coachee move from where they're currently at to the goal that they would like to be at. And this is where the bulk of the coaching conversation usually happens. This is a point at which it's really important to remain as open as possible and to encourage exploration of all of the different options that could help them move towards their goal. You want at this point to try to explore the different breadth of options and also to explore them, each of those, in a little bit of depth. Depending on whether or not that seems appropriate, there are some options that might be a suggestion and then that's discredited for whatever reason. Obviously, it would then be time to move on to a different option. But at this point, you should try to be as broad and as deep as possible about exploring all of the different options available to the person receiving the coaching. Once you've examined the different options, 1 or 2 of these options will normally emerge as the most preferential ones to help them towards their goal. So the final stage of the coaching conversation is for the coachee to decide on the steps forward and commit to these. So at this point, it's important for the coach to establish exactly what the coachee thinks the next step or steps will be, when they are going to do them, and how they might overcome any potential hurdles that might stop them in their tracks. So this is the point where they kind of commit to the next actions. And normally, the coaching session would incorporate these areas and then would conclude naturally at that point. So that's the kind of main basics of effective listening, effective questioning, and structuring a coaching conversation. And hopefully that will have given you a good background to coaching and how it can be used and some of the main concepts behind that. And you may find that actually you already use a lot of these methods during your work or in your home life or as part of groups that you're part of as well. So coaching can be used in a number of different settings. And one of the ways that coaching is being used more frequently now is in action learning sets. So we can now set this understanding of coaching into action learning, which is what we're going to be doing in the programme. So action learning is a form of group coaching, and it's used to help people solve complex problems. So the group of people that are helping are referred to as an action learning set, so that's why we call them action learning sets. And the group are there to help the person who's presenting their problem. Often the issues that are brought to an action learning set are things that are quite complex in nature. So perhaps they involve lots of different people, perhaps they have a very high level of importance, or perhaps they're quite long-term issues that people have been trying to address for quite a long time. So the coaching approach used in action learning enables these complex problems to be explored in a safe and confidential space. Action learning promotes curiosity, inquiry, and reflection. Often the issue being presented is something that's quite personal to the presenter, and it's an issue that they are probably going to be quite heavily invested in solving, but it's probably something that they've been struggling to address as well. And as with coaching, action learning allows them a lot more time than they would normally have to discuss this issue in detail. And so that in that way it promotes more curiosity and inquiry and reflection on the topic. And the action learning set structure and focus help to give them space to explore it in more detail and reflect on all the different elements of the issue, and then hopefully think about how they can make steps forward. So action learning also encourages a deeper understanding of problems thanks to the effective questioning. So as in coaching, we use questions in the action learning set, and the added advantage of an action learning set is that the questions are asked by different members of the group. And of course, they will each bring with them different perspectives and different types of questions that they might use to prompt the discussion. So this can often lead to different aspects of the problem being considered that the individual might not have considered if they were looking at this independently. The questions, as with coaching, are there to act as prompts to encourage that person to talk more. But often because they're being asked by different people in different ways, it leads to new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new approaches to try to solve the problem. And finally, as with coaching, action learning sets very much focused on encouraging action. So they're encouraging action to work towards solving the problem. And action learning is again very forward focused, and the role of the group is to help that individual consider what they can do next to start to address the issue. Sometimes you'll find during an action learning set that there is one or more concrete actions that the person can put into action as soon as possible, and that will help them address the issue. Sometimes though it may be that the action is to discuss it with somebody else or spend more time reflecting on what to do next. So it's not always concrete action, but it's a way towards how we can help solve this problem. So that's what action learning sets are, and hopefully you can see from that how they might be beneficial to support your professional development. And they can be used for sort of career development in terms of where you are going next with your career. It can also be used in terms of development opportunities, so skills, knowledge, experience that you wish to develop and you're wondering how to get that experience. It can also be used for particular issues or challenges, and that could be, for example, perhaps within your group projects as part of the programme, or within the workplace there might be something in particular that you would like to address. So all of these things can be used to support your professional development in an action learning set environment. And what I'm going to finish with is just some of the sort of logistical aspects of the action learning sets and what we'll be doing when we meet towards the end of the month. So as action learning is a form of coaching, it can be helpful to structure the conversation in a similar way, and that's why I've discussed the GLOW model with you today. So if we take that model, action learning sets incorporate this, and they also add an additional 2 parts, and this support the fact that it's a group process rather than an individual coaching process. So the 2 additional elements are learning and review. And the learning is an opportunity for everyone in the group to share what they have learned from the discussion. So whether they presented or not, this is the opportunity for them to share what they have learned. And the review is an opportunity to review as a group how the action learning set went and whether there are any changes to make for future. The action learning set is something that's decided on by the group, and the way that that works, again, is decided by the group. And so the review gives an opportunity to share any feedback with each other and also make any suggestions. And there's also an optional gift round, which makes action learning quite different to coaching. And this is an opportunity for the group to share 1 gift each with the presenter. So that could be a suggestion or it could be an observation in the discussion, but this is something that applies slightly differently from coaching, where you wouldn't offer advice or suggestions. So this is something, it's an optional part of action learning sets, but when I come on to the next slide, which shows the structure, you'll see how that fits into the conversation. The roles within action learning. So there are 3 different roles within an action learning set. These roles may change within each round of action learning, or the facilitator may stay the same. So we have the presenter, who obviously is the person presenting their issue, and normally that will rotate, decided by the group in terms of who's going to be presenting their issue next. The set members, who are responsible for helping the person who's sharing their issue to explore the issue, and they're the people who are effectively the coaches. So they are using the effective listening methods that we discussed and the effective questioning that we discussed to help that person address that issue and think about how they might move forward. And then we also have the facilitator. And the facilitator is the person who's responsible for keeping time and for keeping things to the structure. And they sometimes can be kind of act as part of the set. Often they do. So they will be part of the set as well. They will still be involved in as a set member, and they will be supporting the presenter by effective listening and effective questioning, but they'll also be quite mindful of the time and making sure that the set is working as it should be. So they will help each other out on that. When we meet, I'll be acting as a facilitator for your action learning sets. Okay, so the structure and timing of action learning sets. This can vary, but it's largely consistent with what's on the screen here. Each day will start with the first 2 elements. So this is just for each session. So you just do this the once, and then 3 to 6 repeated for each action learning set round during the day. So we start with reporting in, and this is an opportunity for each person in turn to let the group know what's been happening for them since the last action learning set, and if there's anything that's preoccupying them that might affect their participation in the action learning for that day. If they were someone who presented the last time the set met, then this is also the opportunity for them to let the group know what actions they put into place and what happened for them on that issue that they presented on. So this is a nice way to close that loop from the action learning set in terms of what they discussed last time. After everybody has reported in, it normally takes around 10 to 15 minutes. It depends on the size of the group and how much you will have to say, but it's normally around 10 to 15 minutes. After that, each person will then bid. So we have the bidding ground, and this is where everyone shares what they would present if they were to present that day. So it's normally fairly brief, so it's often just a sentence or 2. It doesn't go into too much detail at this point, but it should also include a level of need. So how important is it for this to be discussed for that person today? Once everyone has shared what they would be wanting to share and their level of need, the group as a group then decide who will present their issue. And depending on the group and how they structure things, they may just decide who's going to be presenting for the first round, or they may decide the subsequent ones depending on how many they intend to go through during that session. So then we move into the main action learning set rounds, and this is on the slide, this is from 3 to 6. And you'll normally complete a few rounds per day. I'd normally say around sort of 3. Obviously, if it's just a half day, it might just be 2. If it's a full day, it might be 4. But it's normally around that sort of figure because each one takes around about 45 minutes. Sometimes they're shorter, sometimes a bit longer, but you also will normally have breaks between them as well. So within each round, you start with the presenter, and so the presenter begins by talking uninterrupted at this stage about what it is that they are wanting to present. This is normally around about 5 minutes, depending on how complex the issue is and how much they have to say about it and how far in the process they are about this. So then you move into the main part of the action learning set. And this is where the group takes it in turns, normally going around in a circle, although this does vary depending on different groups and how they like to function, but normally you will go around and take it in turns. And each person will ask the presenter a question to help them reflect. And this normally follows quite naturally in a conversational style, rather than it being lots of series of individual questioning. And so generally during this is where most of the conversation happens, and you will tend to go through the coaching conversation in a grow format. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes it might be that someone spends most of their time refining their goal. Sometimes it might be that they need to spend more time thinking about the reality. And so it doesn't always follow that we go through the full model. It's not essential to get to the end of that, and depending on the conversation, the presenter, as I say, might need more time in one of those areas. Once you kind of finish the question and answers, and often this comes to a logical end, there seems to be a logical conclusion at some point, or the presenter has got to a point where they've kind of saturated, they've talked about this issue enough. But it's the responsibility of the facilitator and the presenter sometimes, but normally it's the responsibility of the facilitator to manage this process. And at this point, there's the opportunity for the optional gift round. This is optional, and it's up to the presenter whether they wish to receive the gift or not. But this is the point that I mentioned that where it's slightly different to coaching, because at this point, the action learning set participant members are able to share a gift with the presenter. So if the facilitator establishes that the presenter would like the gift round, then each person in turn will share their gift. It's just one thing. It could be a suggestion. It could be an observation. It's just something that they would like to share with the presenter. At this point, there isn't any discussion about those. It's just an opportunity for each set member to share with the presenter, and the presenter can just thank each person for their gift if appropriate. And then to close the action learning set round, so if you've had the gift round or not, you then move on to the learning and review. And each person shares their learning in turn, the presenter sharing their learning last, because they've probably got quite a lot of learning that they might want to think about. So each person will share what it is that they've learned from it. It could be that they have experienced a similar issue, or they are doing, or they've learned something about themselves through the process, anything that they've learned during that set, because you often will gain just as much from being a part of the group as you are when you are the presenter. So once everyone has shared their learning, you then break out of going round in a circle if that's the way that you're choosing to do things, because the next bit is just to review the action learning set. And this is where everybody shares how they think the discussion went, whether there are any changes that they think should be made in future, and talk about how the action learning set is functioning as a group. So it could be around the facilitation, it could be around the types of questions, the speed of the conversation, all those sorts of things can be discussed at this point. And it's also an opportunity for the presenter themselves as well to share how they think the action learning set went. Then you'll normally take a short break. It's normally quite a tiring process for anyone who's been involved in being coached or coaching. It is quite mentally draining. And so you would normally take a short break after each action learning set. And then depending on how long the day is, you would then do your next round of action learning. And you repeat those for as many times as you plan to fit within that day. So that's an overview of coaching and action learning. And hopefully an introduction to the action learning sets that we'll be doing. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time. That's my Philip email address on there, or you can contact me through my website at Jo Alcock Consulting as well, and so that's just joalcock.co.uk. Please do feel free to contact me if you have any questions about coaching or about action learning. And if you have specific questions, please feel free to drop me an email as well. So thank you very much for your time today.